All right, if you're here for the discussion on total war and the bombing of civilians. So, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and remind ourselves exactly what total war is and to be able to redefine it. Now, there's a number of ways to do so, but we want to actually focus on the one that deals with civilians. So what I'm going to have you guys do is to go ahead and go to the Google document, and that first part says to review the total war document. So review that one more time, and what you want to do is you want to be able to copy and paste the quote that's listed in there that deals with civilians in war. Okay, so go ahead and open that doc, pause the video, and when you come back, after you've copied and pasted the particular quote that deals with civilians in war. All right, at this time you should be back, and hopefully you found the correct one. But a few reminders on what total war is. One is the massive size and scope of this particular war. Okay? Two, that the industrial economies of the world, the rich countries of the world, have oriented everything towards the war itself. Okay? And part of those war aims is to be able to get people to know that the people they're fighting are their enemies, and maybe even a little subhuman, in order to motivate them to fight and to do things that they would not normally do so, because some of their policies means that there is no restraint in the war and the type of activities that go on, whether it's mass murders to things like kamikaze attacks, suicide attacks on the enemy. Okay? And particularly the one we're going to focus on today is the targeting of civilians. Okay? And so what you're going to do in the next 20 to 25 minutes is to complete the next part, where we're going to trace the history of aerial bombardment going from World War I to the present day. Okay, to the Second World War. So complete parts 1 through 5. Answer those 10 discussion questions in the next 25 minutes using complete sentences. So go ahead and pause the video there, and I'll see you in about 20 to 25 minutes. All right, once you have that document set complete, just a quick review. Okay, so one, from that document, it talks about the various laws of war, right? What raising your hands means to surrender, or you can't attack civilian shipping, and so forth here. Okay? But one of the key ideas brought about by Giulio Douhet, the Italian general, is that you can and maybe actually utilize aerial bombardment as a means to end the war. So his argument is that, look, if we attack civilians will in the end call for their governments to end the conflict, and in doing so may shorten and therefore also save lives as well. Okay, so that's the logic that he lays out in regards to the usage of aerial bombardment, but it's not accepted widely, and many will see it as barbaric, and particularly in what happens in the Spanish Civil War, where a Spanish town was attacked by German bombers, and as a result of which a number of civilians, women, children, people who were just simply doing work at a marketplace would die as a result. And so they saw it as an atrocity of war. However, once the Second World War begins, everything turns. Everything's a little bit different. And both the British bombing at night and the Americans bombing by day, in the end, will try to bomb aerial targets, on one hand, to pressure the civilians to pressure their governments to end the war, but then also to hit targets that they deem strategically relevant to the war. And the Americans particularly tried this with daylight bombing, albeit with limited success in actually hitting targets without actually attacking homes, suburbs, and so forth. In the case of Japan, it was going to be a little bit different. That aerial bombardment of the military complex had to happen widely. The Japanese military was a lot more dispersed. It wasn't in a single area, and so the only way to really take out targets of military value was just to lay waste to the cities themselves here. And so through the use of things like napalm, American bombers in 1944 and 45 devastated Japanese cities. Major cities like Tokyo, where you have 80 to 90% of the city just completely burned, with hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties and deaths, many of which dying in some of the worst, gruesome ways possible. To add to this, the Second World War gets more complex in that much of the battles actually happen within the scope of cities. And when you have fighting in cities, it is some of the worst you could possibly have, both for those soldiers fighting and the civilians who are caught in between as well. Okay. So what you're going to write at the end of this activity is an editorial. Okay. And answering the question, is the bombing of civilians immoral? Okay, or is it just simply collateral damage in a major war? Okay. So you're going to use the material that you've read already and some of the content material from this lecture in order to write an editorial about 150 to 400 pages, words long. Okay, so with that, this next section, you want to be able to fill out as we talk about the possibility of a seaborne invasion of Japan, and with the notion that we're going to eventually talk about the atomic bomb, both why the atomic bomb would be preferable to invading Japan, and if there's possibly another option rather than the atomic bomb. So go ahead and follow along and answer these graphic organizers as we discuss. So first of which, a seaborne invasion is difficult. For example, June 6, 1944, the Western Allies invaded occupied France. And in doing so, they suffered a number of casualties. Just on a single day, 9,500 casualties. I mean, think about the difficulties of getting in a boat, wading across the water, fully with a full pack of material and supplies and having guns shoot at you and so forth. And so in order to get 5 division of men, 130,000 men ashore, there were 9,500 casualties. Not only that, but in order to prepare for something like this, it would require the might of an entire country to do so. 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft in support, and major logistical planning, because it's not just simply the day of the invasion, but it's to supply an entire army without the right type of port facilities and so forth. So it is a cost in terms of men, supply, money, material, and time as well. Okay. On the other side, in the Pacific, where you're attacking isolated troops. For example, the Tarawa Atoll in November 1943, a really small series of islands, about 12 square miles long, and really narrow strips of land that we're looking at. 35,000 Marines were sent against 5,000 Japanese defenders. And particularly with the Japanese, they were told, both not just by the military command, but what were cultural expectations for them, is to fight to the end, that surrender itself would be considered to be dishonorable. And so when you have a group that is fighting to the end, it results in major casualties for the attacking force. So 4,000 American casualties, which is, again, relatively high for an American battle. You see some of the images that are here. And at the cost of almost every single Japanese defender. You can imagine, even if there is no hope left, they're told to either commit suicide or to attack using these wave attacks on American attackers. And so it becomes a case where Japanese defenders are going to die, and more Americans will die as a result of these fight to the end type strategies. And so the cost of invading many of these Japanese islands are going to be quite deadly. One most famous of which is the Battle of Iwo Jima in February 1945. And if you recognize the picture in the background, a part of why this image is so famous is because of the American sacrifice that it took in order to actually win this particular battle. 8 square miles, and the idea was to take this island as the Americans are island hopping from place to place to eventually reach Japan. This particular island could be used as a Air Force fighter base to escort bombers to Japan, and also a place where damaged bombers could actually land as well. And so the necessity for it, the American military command thought it was quite necessary to be able to take this island. Really small, 8 square miles in size, 100,000 plus Americans pitted against 20,000 plus Japanese defenders on a really small, tight, volcanic rock that could only fit really 2 air bases. And it resulted in 28,000 American casualties, which is enormously high, way above the ratio of normal casualties in a battle that Americans are involved in, and at the cost of about 21,000 Japanese dead. I mean, the sheer number makes it so that as the American Marines were raising the American flag on top of Mount Suribachi, this image becomes sort of iconic because of the sacrifice that Americans, Marines, and other servicemen made in order to win this particular battle. Subsequently, in the invasion of Okinawa, it is the first home island that the Americans would invade right in the further south, right here. And it's going to also include Japanese civilians as well. 500,000 Americans against over 100,000 Japanese defenders hunkered up in the southern part of the island, resulted in over 40,000 American casualties and almost every single Japanese defender who was there. Not only that, but several thousand Japanese civilians as well, who enlisting the Japanese propaganda and sort of the discussions on race, particularly that the Americans were barbarians who would in the end kill and rape children and elderly and so forth here. Many of them ended up committing suicide as well. So several thousand civilians would die, not just in the fighting, but then also afterwards as well. That lays in question as to what should happen with the invasion of the Japanese home islands to end this war here. 200,000 plus square miles, 72 million that are left in the home islands. Considering to take the small 8 square mile island of Iwo Jima, what would the Japanese home islands cost everyone? There was an early estimate of 1 million U.S. casualties. And just to put things in context, the United States have fought in the Second World War from 1941 to 1945, and 1 million American casualties had been suffered up until this point here. There's the estimate that maybe that number will double with the invasion of the Japanese home islands, an estimate of about 5 to 10 million Japanese civilians, maybe more, maybe less. Either way, these numbers are highly conflicted, and people contest these particular numbers. These are not official by any means, and nor does it say that this was going to happen in the first place. Now, are there any alternatives to this? There are several. So are there other ways to possibly end this war? One is through diplomacy. And that diplomacy happens to deal with the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union and the Japanese have had a non-aggression pact for most of the Second World War. And negotiations were through, potentially to give the Soviet Union some diplomatic advantages after the Second World War ends, if they will attack the Japanese army currently stationed in China. Basically, keeping them in China, the Soviet Union suffering casualties in the attack, and many of which will not be able to go home to Japan to defend the home island. So that was one possibility, that this would, in the end, will force the Japanese to surrender. So that's option number one. Option number two, a naval blockade against Japan, basically forcing millions to starve. Again, the Japanese Japan is a series of islands, and they need support from elsewhere. And so if we could surround the Japanese home islands with our Navy and Air Force and so forth, it may force Japan to come to terms. However, we've seen the use of Japanese kamikazes to lethal force on the American Navy, where you sink one ship and it could be hundreds, if not thousands, of Americans who may die as a result of this. So a naval blockade, we don't know how much time it might take, but this is another option other than a massive invasion of Japan. Then there's the other one. The creation of the atomic bomb, something that most of the nations have been pursuing, but actually had been succeeded by a secret American program known as the Manhattan Project. This is something that was so secretive that President Harry Truman, who has succeeded Franklin Delano Roosevelt, did not even know when he was vice president of the United States. But when he was informed of the successful dropping of the first atomic bomb in New Mexico, he authorized the use on Japan. And so an ultimatum was issued to Japan. So they could respond and say, we could tell them we have a weapon of massive proportion and scale that we would be using on Japanese cities, but there was no response. Now, there was another possibility, maybe perhaps that we could actually drop this bomb in Tokyo Bay or somewhere where the Japanese could see it without suffering the massive casualties that dropping it on a city might have here. So that's another option, whereby you could drop the bomb somewhere as sort of here's the power that we have on hand. That's another possible option. Now, the United States at this point only had 2 bombs remaining. So that's a decision that the U.S. military command had to make. Do we use it for show, or do we actually use it on an actual civilian target? Okay. So the ultimatum is issued. Then on August 6, 1945, on the bomber named Enola Gay, flown by pilot Paul Tibbets here, went to Hiroshima. And from there, there's a link to this particular video. You'll watch the first about 10-15 minutes. And as you do so, watch this film and list as many of the effects that the atomic bomb had on the people of Hiroshima as it is dropped. So please go ahead and view this. Pause the video here, open up the next one that's provided for you in the link. All right. At this point, you've probably seen the video and the impact of that first bomb, nicknamed the Little Boy. At ground impact, 6,000 degrees Fahrenheit, where 70,000 were killed almost immediately. 140,000 were dead by 1946, say, due to effects of things like nuclear fallout, acid rain, or just simply the dying of burns or injuries that were suffered that have been infected. And eventually, thousands more would die from radiation poisoning. And not only that, but the high rates of cancer that those who were in the vicinity would suffer as a result of this. And so August 6th passed, and you have the world entering a new age, the nuclear age, where a single plane and a single weapon can create such massive devastation. The ultimatum was brought back to Japan. The leadership, however, stalled. They did not discuss. There were those who wanted to continue the fight. And so therefore, on August 9th, 1945, a second bomb was dropped on the actual secondary target on the city of Nagasaki in southern Japan. And so this second bomb, albeit killed fewer people, but was just as devastating. So end result is that with these bombs, Japan will surrender on September 2nd, 1945. And finally, the worst war in human history comes to an end. And so for you, what you want to be able to do is, from the packet that we've read, from the discussion that we've had here, you want to go ahead and finish up that last portion there, the newspaper editorial. Is the bombing of civilians immoral? Or are civilian casualties just simply collateral damage in a major war? So follow the guidelines that are listed in the link, and I look forward to your responses.